Okay, you can all relax. We'll start promptly at 1. I realize not all the witnesses are here. Okay, if we can all take our seats, we're going to start so promptly it'll shock the world. Mr. Schatz, I know you're looking at your watch saying this doesn't happen in Congress. Well, it won't happen until Mr. Cummings comes back, but we should get there. The committee will come to order 1 minute early. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. It is our job to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to federal bureaucracy. Today, we continue that mission. For months, we have been engaged in a national discussion about how government takes and spends money from hardworking taxpayers. As this debate has unfolded, a lot of attention centers on which taxpayers should be paying more so that government could keep spending more. The question hasn't been asked enough, although it's been asked, whether or not Washington should be taking more. I come from a business background, and the only way you can make more is to deliver a better product. You need to be transparent, and you need your services to be delivered efficiently. Understanding we are not questioning that services need to be delivered here today, but rather ensuring that the delivery of services be done in the most cost-effective possible way. Too often, the distinction between needed services and wasteful government gets blurred. Perhaps it's for political purposes on occasion and programs. So I believe we can be an honest broker. We will end no programs, but we will work and are working in our hearing today at finding places to find out if, in fact, these financial realities need to be fixed and that they are clearly broken. Ignoring the problem is no longer an option. We are running out of time because when government doesn't function properly, American people lose access to important government services. Any other enterprise producing nearly a $1 trillion deficit for the foreseeable future every year would, in fact, be shut down. Last year, the government reported a total of $108 billion in improper payments would have taken us down by 1/10 of our problem. In 2011, the Inspector General community identified potential savings produced from government reform totaling another $100 billion. The General Accountability Office has published report after report identifying dozens and dozens of government agencies that do duplicate and overlapping and cost-inefficient projects that hardworking Americans pay tens of billions of dollars a year for. We need and have a blueprint to change that. We need what we need is the political will from both parties and the President to do so. And we have never had a better reason. Ultimately, as the debate in other committees is on tax increases or simply cutting programs to spend less money, we are the committee that needs to be part of a fix that is a win-win. A win for the taxpayer because he doesn't have to pay more. A win for the service recipient because, in fact, services can be delivered for less. That's our challenge. It's what we're here today to talk about. I don't believe it falls anywhere from the far left to the far right of the ideological spectrum to reform government. Just the opposite. I believe that it is in the interest of all of us, no matter where you are in the spectrum, to spend less doing what we've agreed or disagreed to do, so that, in fact, the American people have a smaller burden than they do today. I believe today's hearing will take us a long way in that direction. We have a distinguished panel here to tell us about it. And with that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
I want to thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. It is very encouraging that the first two committee hearings, this committee, have been bipartisan and focused on the core jurisdiction of this committee. Your staff did an exemplary job leading up to this hearing and sharing information and making the planning of this hearing a bipartisan effort. The title of this hearing gets right to the heart of the issues we are examining today. The title is Government Spending: How Can We Best Address the Billions of Dollars Wasted Every Year? We in Congress talk all the time about cutting waste and making the government more efficient. It's time to go from talking to acting. I'm looking forward to hearing from the witnesses testifying today about concrete actions the Administration and Congress can take to save taxpayers money. The Department of Defense is responsible for an appalling amount of wasteful spending each year through its contracts. DOD obligated $365 billion for contracts in fiscal year 2012, and the Department has had significant problems with contract management and oversight. The Congressional Research Service recently reported that DOD acquisition programs have experienced, quote, poor performance against the backdrop of war in Afghanistan, spiraling contract costs, and decline in the size of the defense acquisition workforce, end of quote. In testimony before this committee last month, a witness from the Government Accountability Office said that several DOD IT investments, quote, experienced significant performance problems and were indeed high risk, end of quote. One of the specific examples the Chairman and GAO pointed out in that hearing was a contract that the Air Force canceled last December after having spent $1 billion. The Expeditionary Combat Support System was plagued by delays and cost overruns. Representative Spear highlighted this issue in a letter to us in December, Mr. Chairman, and I agree that it makes sense for the committee to adopt her proposal to investigate this contract further. Another example is the $750 million in overpayments by DOD to the contractor that provides food supplies to United States troops in Afghanistan. This is an issue that has been highlighted by the ranking member of the National Security Subcommittee, John Tierney, and the subcommittee's chairman, Mr. Chavez. Ranking member Tierney has also been a leader in exposing problems with DOD's F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the largest weapons procurement program in history, which has had substantial cost overruns and repeated schedule delays. Full production of the Joint Strike Fighter program has been delayed by 6 years, and the cost per unit have doubled. We're better than that. We can do much, much better. Another area of significant federal spending is crop insurance. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a New York Times article from January 15, 2013, titled, and I quote, "Record Taxpayer Costs is Seen for Crop Insurance," end of quote.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. According to this article, the government pays $1.3 billion, $1.3 billion each year to 15 insurance companies. The article states, and I quote, "Government documents show that taxpayers have paid nearly $7 billion so far to subsidize premiums for 2012. The documents also show that taxpayers could pay another $7 billion to underwrite losses by the insurance companies and other costs," end of quote. These are just a few examples of government waste. There are many, many more. And I hope the committee will conduct vigorous oversight to expose these and other sources of wasteful spending and ensure that necessary actions are taken to address the root problems. As I've said many times, and I said just here today, that taxpayers want to make sure that their tax dollars are spent effectively and efficiently. And, Mr. Chairman, we are committed to work with you in a bipartisan way to not only see where that waste is taking place, but then to come up with meaningful solutions to try to address them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and we will. We now recognize our distinguished panel of witnesses. Mr. Tom Schatz is President of Citizens Against Government Waste. Ms. Ryan Alexander is the President of Taxpayers for Common Sense. The Honorable Dan Blair is President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. And Mr. John Kamensky is a Senior Fellow at the IBM Center for Business and Government. And, ladies and gentlemen, pursuant to the committee rules, would you please rise to take an oath and be sworn? And raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record indicate, please be seated. Let the record indicate all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize Mr. Schatz, I just want to thank you all for being here. Often we talk about individuals coming before us as witnesses. Ultimately, you are all partners in the process of understanding and exposing waste in government. So I'm particularly pleased to start off this oversight panel with this oversight hearing with this panel. And with that, you all are experienced. You know the 5 minutes. You know the red, green, black, blue, the whole bit. So I know you'll finish up pretty close to that 5 minutes. And with that, I recognize Mr. Schatz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I ask that my full testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection, all testimonies will be entered in the record.
My name is Thomas Schatz. I am the President of Citizens Against Government Waste, a nonprofit organization with more than 1 million members and supporters nationwide. It is no secret that government waste is present throughout every agency, and all functions could be performed more effectively and efficiently. Recommendations to eliminate waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement are regularly provided by GAO, CBO, the President's budget, and congressional committees. Outside of Congress, think tanks, advocacy groups, and private sector companies also provide information on government expenditures. For example, since 1993, CAGW has released Prime Cuts, a compendium of recommendations that emanate from both public and private sources. The most recent edition of Prime Cuts identified 691 recommendations that would save taxpayers $391.9 billion in the first year and $1.8 trillion over 5 years. Over the years, there have really only been 2 large comprehensive studies of government spending, the Hoover Commission under President Truman and the Grace Commission under President Reagan. The Hoover Commission inspired many states to establish similar entities, especially the Little Hoover Commission in California, which has been operating continuously since 1962. However, there is no similar permanent entity at the Federal level. Now, any evaluation of government programs should both determine whether or not the expenditures are complying with statutory requirements and how the programs could and should function in today's world. In addition to thinking about how programs relate to current needs, there should also be a mechanism in place to prevent the establishment of new programs when current programs already serve a particular need. Indeed, an underlying reason for government waste and mismanagement is Congress's tendency to create a program to solve a problem. Unfortunately, neither the House nor Senate has adopted proposed rules changes that would require committee reports to contain an analysis by CRS on whether or not the bill creates a new Federal program that would duplicate or overlap any existing program. The reporting committee would also be required to explain why the creation of the new program would be necessary if a similar program already existed. On the other hand, Congress could act at any time to terminate or consolidate duplicative and overlapping programs. In particular, findings that were produced by GAO in 2 annual reports published in 2011 and 2012. For example, in 2012, GAO recommended consolidating Federal offices, selling excess uranium at the Department of Energy, and cutting improper payments by Medicare and Medicaid. The 2012 report cited 209 science, technology, engineering, and math programs costing $3.1 billion spread across 13 agencies in fiscal year 2010. More than one-third of those programs were adopted and first funded between fiscal years 2005 and 2010, yet the United States still does not have enough future workers in STEM fields, and U.S. students are still behind in math and science compared to other highly technological nations. GAO found 47 job training programs in 9 agencies that cost $18 billion in 2009. Only 5 have had an impact study completed since 2004 to determine whether or not participants secured a job as a result of the program rather than a separate cause. Finally, and most absurdly, there are more than 50 programs across 20 agencies to promote financial literacy. There is no reliable data on the total cost of those programs, and a government that itself is going broke has no business trying to teach the American people how to balance their checkbooks. My written testimony contains several specific proposals to cut wasteful spending and improve efficiency, including replacing the $1 bill with the $1 coin, eliminating the medium extended air defense system, reducing identity theft at the IRS, increasing the use of recovery audit contractors, and reducing or eliminating farm subsidies, particularly the sugar program and the proposed dairy market stabilization program. In regard to information technology, we commend the efforts by this committee to address wasteful spending in this area. Agencies should also be increasing the use of cloud services and at the same time reducing the number of unnecessary or excessive IT software licenses. Finally, we urge the committee to adopt structural reforms of the U.S. Postal Service while avoiding a taxpayer bailout. While programs can be consolidated, reformed, or terminated by Congress at any time, such actions have been few and far between. In addition to taking action on specific proposals to cut wasteful spending, Congress should also consider establishing a new commission to provide recommendations to reorganize Federal agencies, as well as a sunset commission. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee today and would be glad to answer any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Schatz, for your testimony. And we will withhold questions until we've heard from all of the witnesses, but appreciate your testimony. Let me now recognize Ryan Alexander, President of Taxpayers for Common Cause. You're welcome and recognized.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to testify this afternoon. I'm President of Taxpayers for Common Sense, a national nonprofit budget watchdog. I sat before this committee nearly 2 years ago testifying on GAO's high-risk and duplicative program reports. I want to recognize one positive change since then. The wasteful volumetric ethanol excise tax credit expired in 2011, so there's some good news. But there's much more work to be done. Almost every major piece of legislation of the 112th Congress, from the Budget Control Act to the Transportation Bill to the Fiscal Cliff Deal, highlighted the need to reduce waste without really reducing waste. The Department of Defense is the world's largest bureaucracy and extremely vulnerable to waste and duplication. The cost of TRICARE has more than doubled in the last decade, and in FY12 will exceed more than $50 billion due to unchanged premiums. We can modernize the program and maintain the promise of health care coverage for the men and women who have served our country. Significant savings can also be found through acquisition and contracting reform. The Pentagon is the government's largest buyer, and many contractors rely on the government for the vast majority of their business. We are concerned that the 2.0 version of DoD's better buying power turns away from fixed-price contracts. Contracts are not one-size-fits-all, but the specter of losing billions of taxpayer dollars should be sufficient incentive for a company to control costs. The National Nuclear Security Administration's nuclear weapon laboratories and production plants are operated and managed by private corporations. These government-owned, contractor-operated contracts have in some cases actually increased NNSA's persistent problems with inflated overhead costs, security breaches, and construction cost overruns. On the positive side, lawmakers appear ready to uphold the funding freeze on the CMRR project at Los Alamos National Laboratory. A similar fate should meet the troubled mixed oxide fuel program. Acquisition is a major challenge across Federal agencies, as evidenced by the failures of Future Combat Systems, SBINet, U.S. Visit, Deepwater, and others. A common thread among these programs is the use of lead system integrators, where the government relies on the contractor to define and meet its needs. As then Senator Truman observed, I have never yet found a contractor who, if not watched, would not leave the government holding the bag. Public lands are taxpayer assets and should be managed in ways that preserve their value and ensure a fair return for taxpayers. Securing a fair return for the hundreds of newly proposed wind and solar projects on Federal lands is vital. Similarly, taxpayers are shortchanged by coal leases, which allow companies to pay royalties based on domestic prices, not their actual export prices. Finally, the General Mining Law of 1872 collects no royalty from hard rock mining on Federal lands. Taxpayers cannot continue to simply give gold away. The Title 17 loan guarantee program jeopardizes billions of dollars if project loans default. Solinder's $535 million default brought the program under increased scrutiny, but the $2 billion loan guarantee for the nearly bankrupt USEC and the $8.3 billion loan guarantee for the Southern Company carry much greater potential losses. Ineffective and duplicative agriculture policies waste billions of dollars. Direct payments must end immediately. The highly subsidized crop insurance program, which cost taxpayers a record $14 billion in FY12, must be reined in, and efforts to create a shallow loss programs that crowd out private sector risk management options must be rejected. Congress consolidated programs that included performance measurements in MAP 21, but failed to address the underlying issue of demand for transportation projects exceeding revenue generated to cover their costs. In just 5 years, Congress transferred more than $50 billion to backfill the Highway Trust Fund. The Essential Air Service, which subsidizes flights between rural communities and regional hub airports costing up to $1,000 per flight, should be eliminated except in Alaska, saving $1 billion. Many communities can maintain transportation links through intercity bus service with little or no subsidy. Tens of billions of dollars are lost to waste and fraud in Medicare and Medicaid. Last Congress, Senators Carper and Coburn introduced the Medicare and Medicaid Fighting Fraud and Abuse to Save Taxpayer Dollars Act. Representative Roskam introduced a companion. More needs to be done, but this represents a start. More than $1 trillion in Federal revenue is foregone each year due to nearly 200 tax expenditures, spending channeled through the tax system that lacks oversight. Some tax expenditures Congress should look at for 10-year savings include prohibiting last-in, first-out accounting, ending deferral on foreign earnings, and converting the mortgage interest deduction to tax credit and limiting it to a one-home mortgage totaling $500,000. The Army Corps of Engineers needs a prioritization system with explicit criteria from Congress. Up until the earmark moratorium, prioritization and guidance came in the form of project-by-project funding and annual appropriations. The Sandy supplemental and regular energy and water appropriations have pots of funding without enough guidance. Congress needs to increase the strings and direction without resorting to earmarks. We always like to point out that the Corps' motto should be, we may take twice as long, but we cost twice as much. Superstorm Sandy brought into relief problems surrounding our approach to disasters. The current ad hoc, scattershot approach to disaster funding creates an opportunity for waste, fraud, and abuse. Worse, sometimes the money actually puts people and infrastructure back in harm's way. The number and cost of major disaster declarations has increased in recent decades due to an increase of major weather events, but also because of our nation's programs are more generous responding to disasters than pre-responding to them. Through both the National Flood Insurance Program and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers flood and storm damage reduction programs, we encourage development in an unsustainable manner. Furthermore, research indicates that every dollar spent on mitigation saves $4 or more in recovery. We should be helping people, communities, and states prepare for disaster and respond to disaster in a way that protects taxpayers and reduces future risks and costs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My written testimony and reports we submitted contain much greater detail, and Taxpayers for Common Sense would be happy to work with the committee to identify other ways to ensure that our tax dollars are spent wisely and effectively. Sorry for the overrun.
Thank you for your testimony, and we will include your entire testimony and additional comments for the record. We'll now recognize and welcome Dan Blair. Mr. Blair is President of the National Academy of Public Administration. Welcome, sir, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Mike. It's good to see you, Mr. Cummings. I appreciate this opportunity to testify today and thank the committee members. I'm Dan Blair, President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. The Academy is a nationally recognized, nonpartisan, not-for-profit chartered by Congress to address and advise all levels of government on pressing issues of public administration. We're comprised of almost 750 fellows who are selected by our membership for their significant contributions in the field of public administration. I ask consent that my entire written statement be accepted for the record, and I'm pleased to summarize.
Without objection.
Your hearing today is timely and helps key up many important management issues that Congress and the administration could tackle to solve some of the most pressing problems in government. Government has become increasingly complex, and actions on the Federal level resonate at the State and local level. We have today an opportunity to begin to find common ground to address long-term structural, fiscal, and governance problems before they potentially overwhelm our budget. Collaboration between Federal, State, local, and private sector stakeholders is critical for improving program delivery and minimizing waste, fraud, and abuse. To that end, the Academy began work with the Office of Management and Budget in October 2011 to involve stakeholders nationwide in developing pilot projects that test innovations in how states administer federally funded programs. Funded through the Partnership Fund for Program Integrity Innovation, the Collaborative Forum network has increased to more than 750 in-person and online participants who share best practices and lessons learned for how to improve payment accuracy, improve service delivery, and administrative efficiency, and reduce barriers to program access. To date, this work has resulted in the funding of 9 pilot projects, with more expected to come. In addition to collaboration, evidence-based decision-making can aid in identifying those programs worthy of continued government support. One use of this approach can be found in what is called Pay for Success. This approach utilizes a financing organization where private investors provide upfront funding to help achieve a specific result, and the government only pays if the agreed-upon goal is achieved. Using this third-party approach enables government to partner with private and nonprofit entities who already have demonstrated their ability to produce high returns on investments. The approach also maximizes flexibility and allows the government to piggyback on already existing infrastructures and networks. And importantly, the risk is borne by the third party for producing the results. Another example of evidence-based decision-making involves the Washington State model. This model provides State administrators with tools to identify which programs are working and worthy of continued funding. This allows cuts in funding to be targeted to those programs which are not working. Apart from identifying ways of identifying government investment, challenges remain for agencies in identifying prospects for waste, fraud, and abuse. Such tools include greater use of data and analytics to strengthen financial management controls and facilitate improved mechanisms for preventing and detecting improper payments. My written statement identifies additional opportunities to streamline programs across the Federal Government. As Mr. Schatz noted, the 2012 and 2011 GA reports on duplication overlap identified many areas for review. While a belts and suspenders approach for some programs may be desirable, this overlap and duplication is often an unintended consequence of the proliferation of government programs. One way to address this is through the consolidation of programs within a department. Another way is through a virtual reorganization and the establishment of interagency councils. Broader structural reorganizations can compensate for deficiencies of current ones, but can be challenging in practice. In conclusion, Congress and the executive branch have an opportunity to work together to reduce waste, fraud, and abuse, invest in effective evidence-based programs, and create a results-oriented performance culture inside the Federal Government. The Memos to Leader project my testimony highlights addresses issues in 9 critical government management areas that are ripe for reform. Key areas include the nominations process, budget process reform, civil service reform, managing large public-private partnerships, rationalizing the intergovernmental system, and IT transparency. The Academy possesses a unique set of fellows who stand ready to assist in these critical management challenges. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. I would be pleased to answer your questions.
Well, thank you, and we will, as I said, withhold questions. We'll hear our last witness next, and that's Mr. Jonathan Kamensky, and he's a senior fellow with the IBM Center for the Business of Government. Welcome, sir, and you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Pull that up real close and as loud as you can.
I'm pleased to have the opportunity to testify before you on strategies to reduce costs and improve performance in the Federal Government's mission support functions. I think this gets at your win-win criteria that you mentioned earlier. I'm a senior fellow with the IBM Center for the Business of Government. The IBM Center connects public sector research with practice by sponsoring independent research by top minds in both academia and the nonprofit sector. 2 years ago, the IBM Center produced a report, summarized here, identifying 7 leading commercial strategies that could contribute up to $1 trillion in reduced costs of Federal operations over a 10-year period, while improving performance. I would like to share these with you today. But first, why do we think this magnitude of savings is possible? The mission support costs in the Federal Government for cross-government activities such as personnel processing, contracting, supply chain management historically average about 30% of total operating costs, compared to about 15% in the private sector. While the precise numbers may not compare well, they do suggest that changing the way mission support functions are operated to reflect leading practices in the private sector may provide opportunities for cost savings. I would like to highlight 4 of the 7 strategies that are outlined in our report. All 7 are in my written statement. Strategy 1, consolidate information technology infrastructure to the extent possible. The government's cost of operating its IT infrastructure are high when compared to the private sector. In addition, according to GAO, only about 1/3 of the government's IT investment in fiscal year 2011 was actually spent on direct mission-related IT, such as air traffic control systems or the Veterans Benefit Determination System. The Gartner Group reports that by reducing IT overhead management costs, consolidating data centers, eliminating redundant networks, and standardizing applications could lead to savings of 20 to 30%. Strategy 2, streamline government supply chains to be more efficient and effective. The government annually procures about $550 billion in goods and services. These are purchased largely through independent procurement processes and individual agencies. In contrast, large corporations have transformed their procurement and supply chain systems by integrating them across the enterprise. Now, there have been efforts to do this in the Federal Government. For example, starting in 2005, OMB launched a strategic sourcing initiative to leverage the purchasing scale of the Federal Government. Progress to date has resulted in savings, but these savings have been less than 0.5% of the Federal Government's procurement spending. In contrast, private sector companies report savings of 10% or more. GAO last year concludes that if the government could achieve a 10% savings level, that could be savings of up to about $50 billion. Strategy 3, apply advanced business analytics to reduce improper payments. The administration is moving aggressively to reduce improper payments with strong congressional support. However, GAO says more could be done, and industry experience suggests that this is a valid conclusion. Industry experts believe that expanding the use of recovery audits and advanced business analytics could increase the identification rate of improper payments to about 40%. This could potentially generate an additional $200 billion over the next decade. Strategy 4, move to a greater reliance on electronic self-service and reduce the government's field operations footprint. Most government agencies have citizen-facing services that rely on largely manual, paper-based business processes. The government could both reduce costs and improve citizens' experiences by moving as many touch points to electronic platforms as possible and rethink the footprint of its field operations. Other countries have done this by creating a one-stop approach to social services. For example, Service Canada is an agency that delivers 70 services on behalf of 13 other agencies, online, in person, and on the phone. This has allowed the Canadian government to reduce the number of field offices, reduce costs, and improve service delivery at the same time. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, it is important to emphasize that leadership and governance are key to implementation. The 7 strategies outlined in my testimony are being addressed by the administration, but with different levels of intensity. One approach to create concerted action might be for the OMB director to appoint a steering committee led by the deputy director for the management at OMB and a subset of departmental secretaries. A small central support team could be created operating out of OMB or the President's Management Council, not unlike the Recovery Act implementation team, to ensure action. For each of the 7 areas, a cross-agency sub-team could be created and work under the direction of a departmental deputy secretary who is charged with action. So I would like to conclude at this point and thank you again for the opportunity to speak before you, and I would be pleased to answer any of your questions.
Well, thank you, and we'll now turn to some questions. I want to thank all of the panelists for their contribution today. It's interesting to have you all suggest these potential areas in which we can cut and save and be on that side of the aisle. Sometimes from a practical position, it's very difficult, much more difficult on our side. again, of the witness table. But I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, and then we'll turn to other members for questions. First of all, I think we're facing the prospect of sequestration. It's coming down the road, and I think my guess right now, I didn't think this before the holidays, but I think after the holidays, I think that's going to go into effect. And that is going to, of course, impact dramatically. Probably defense has the biggest cut, and some other programs. Most of the sort of core programs are protected. This is an opportunity to save some money, to institute some savings. Mr. Schatz, you cited a number of past studies and commissions, et cetera, several major commissions. Maybe another commission is necessary, but it still ends up coming back to Congress. And here we're in a situation where these cuts are going to come. I think the cuts could go beyond, and some of you described other potential areas of savings. But maybe we could go down and get your take on what you would do, again, with sequestration looming, to make cuts. You've talked about some things, but maybe some specifics you might suggest to Congress, since that looks like it's pretty eminent. Mr. Schatz first.
Thank you, Mr. Mica. Sequestration, if it does go into effect, may push Congress to look at spending across the board, because there's a large part of government expenditures that are simply not included in sequestration. Certainly, we have been very critical of excessive defense spending. We led the effort to eliminate the alternate engine for the Joint Strike Fighter. Certainly, TCS and other taxpayer groups were very helpful in that effort. And yes, you can find specific examples, but across-the-board cuts eliminate both wasteful spending and what might be essential spending at the same time.
But that could be targeted, could it not?
Well, my understanding of sequestration is that at least the way it's set up now, it's across the board.
But again, sequestration will probably go into effect, and then what will happen is Congress will say,
well, maybe they'll wake up and say, let's do this the right way.
Exactly. Well, I'm asking you, and you got a couple minutes here to give me what's the right way. Maybe we could impose something that redirects the cuts, go beyond, of course, the big gouge for defense. Not that but people talked about defense contracting being out of control, and IT across the board solutions that can save billions of dollars. You all gave lots of areas we could save. Here we have an opportunity with sequestration coming up. And if it goes into effect, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to run around with their hair on fire. But we have an opportunity to redirect that. How would you do that?
Well, again, I would look at everything, not just the areas.
Everything's on the table.
You have to, because
there's probably not an agency you'd agree that couldn't stand some trimming, efficiencies, et cetera.
Oh, absolutely. Any organization can cut between 10 and 15% of its expenditures.
Well, that's well within the range of what we're talking. Ms. Alexander.
We released a report last fall with $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction called sliding past sequestration. So one thing is people could just adopt all our recommendations, although I wouldn't expect that.
Then you've got your, well, look at those.
I would just point out, and that was submitted with our testimony as part of the record, which we'd like to be submitted in the record. I think a couple points just to point out. I do think within the context of defense spending, looking at service contracts as a particular area where there could be reductions in spending without necessarily affecting core function. I think that this committee in particular has a huge opportunity to help reshape how we do disaster spending. We waste a huge amount of money through disaster spending, and both the increase in disaster funds, there's just an opportunity to look at a better way.
Well, we put in some of those things, although they got pretty hoggy at the end, and
we made some
funded
projects. Flood insurance program last year.
We don't have, well, maybe the chairman gets a little bit of discretion here, our acting chairman. But I had you slammed transportation and the MAP program, and the problem is sometimes the groups, you don't get the support from the groups. I remember FA on the 20th extension when I said this can't go on, this madness, because that cost millions of dollars, those extensions, leaving our programs at bay. And so I sent over one extension, just cutting out airline ticket subsidies of $1,000 or more, and we closed down the FAA partially for 2 weeks. All hell broke loose. Where were you then, Ms. Alexander, when I was getting my brains beat out?
Well, I'm pretty sure I can find a press release where we thanked you for doing that.
I want to see that. We'll make it part of the record. Mr. Blair and Mr. Kamensky, would you answer the sequestration and how we target, what would you do, again, in our shoes?
I think that you're going to have a blueprint before you when
you're not on.
I'm sorry. I think that the Congress will have a blueprint before it when GAO comes out with its new overlap and duplication list. I think that's going to give you an idea of areas in which efficiencies can be achieved, that it shows that multiple agencies or multiple departments are trying to deliver to the same constituency group on similar, not duplicative programs, and that's a start.
Yeah. And I might say that I think in the Republican rules we put in, the reports have to now show if it's duplicative in addition to constitutionality or something. Kamensky, real quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sequestration does not allow trade-offs.
Well, we write the law. It'll be the revised, come what may after sequestration A.
But just plus or minus dollars will not solve the challenge. What will need to happen is changing the way government does business. And, for example, in energy efficiency, in order to be able to have much more energy-efficient operations, sometimes it requires an investment up front for longer-term savings. If you look only at the how do we cut dollars next month, sequestration will do that, but it may not actually improve operations very well.
Look at long-term, too. Thank you. Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to this panel for all of your very specific testimony and ideas. The word, it brings to mind the words waste, fraud, and abuse. That's always thrown out when people can't think of what should be cut or how to preserve. I found your testimony edifying indeed. I'd like to ask Mr. Kamensky a question because he pointed to a specific example that was in part under my own jurisdiction in another committee. It was your discussion of improper payments. Mr. Micah is aware of this because he was on the same committee. It was the committee that had a jurisdiction over a great many of the Recovery Act funds, and my particular subcommittee, the subcommittee which I chaired, had jurisdiction over more than $5 billion of those funds, which were to go to each and every state, District of Columbia, and every territory. And the funds had to be, we had to deliver the funds swiftly because of the recession. The whole point was to stimulate the economy and create jobs. Now, so I was intrigued. I'm now going to your testimony. I'm intrigued by your discussion of the administration's recovery board. Apparently, the first time anything of the sort had been used, and you say in preventing rather than recovering improper payments. And you say this shows the value of a concerted effort essentially up front and across agency. Now, you point out that the Recovery Act was dealing with upwards of more than 25 agencies, and we had nothing in place in those agencies beforehand to carry that out. So my question goes to how did this pilot, I will call it, effort prevent these overpayments through this special board? I don't know if this board still exists or whether you think we could apply this to other circumstances because there are many instances where essentially you are distributing funds through many agencies or through all the states. I want to know, how did they, given the speed with which this money had to go out, how did they prevent, rather than catch after the fact, these improper payments?
Well, the Congress, and as part of the legislation, required quarterly reporting, which actually turned into much more frequent reporting internally within the agencies. And all the spending data were shared through this Recovery Operations Center that Mr. Earl Devaney, who was the chair of the board, set up. And that way they're able to look at data from a number of different agencies at the same time and look for patterns that were suspicious. So, for example, when you notice funds from 3 or 4 different Recovery Act programs going to a yacht in the harbor of Miami, which is one of the examples that he gave, he says, let's go look there and see whether this is a legitimate operation. So it's an ability to quickly find where things are being requested or being spent, and then moving in quickly.
Well, now, I don't know if you know if the board exists or if you think this board would be useful in other circumstances. That was a very special circumstance. Recovery Act building is still going on. Money is all out. Are there circumstances within the government today in the usual course of business where you think something similar, or would we be accused of establishing another, quote, bureaucracy?
The Recovery Act Transparency Board, I believe, is authorized through the end of this fiscal year. There is a Government Accountability Transparency Board that was administratively developed by President Obama, which is looking at ways of taking some of the lessons from the Recovery Board and extending them administratively at least, and potentially even legislatively. Agencies such as the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services have something like this for payments that they make. They make like 1 billion payments or transactions a year, and so they have a mini version of it. But oftentimes it's when you're able to compare funding flows across agencies that you're able to detect patterns that are sort of anomalies. And so something equivalent to that may be one of the lessons that comes out of the Recovery Act legislation.
Well, the chairman of our full committee has shown an interest in institutionalizing some of that lessons learned. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an area that we can't have bipartisan agreement on. I'll go back to President Obama's inauguration speech where he identified some Federal programs as outworn and inadequate. I would agree that we have some Federal programs that do need to be sunset, and we need to be able to identify and be able to work together, Republicans and Democrats, identify those programs and let's sunset them. Let's deal with that. But I do have a series of questions and one piece of good news for you, Mr. Schatz. I noticed in your testimony you referred to a Senate action to try to put into the Senate rules a duplication requirement, that failed in the Senate last time. That is something I personally worked on and is in the House rules for this year, to be able to identify duplicate programs before they go into effect. So I need to get you a copy of the latest House rules so you get a chance to identify that, because that is a very important thing to us. There's 2 ways to deal with duplication. One is to get it out once it's there, and one is to prevent it from starting. And our focus in the House is to try to find ways to prevent duplicated programs from beginning, and so we can take those on. In the middle of all that, of your testimony, though, you also mentioned the RAC audit process, called an effective process. There are billions of dollars that have been recovered in the RAC audit process dealing with Medicare and Medicaid. Now they're not doing pay and chase anymore. They're trying to identify some of those things. We do have some issues on that, and I wanted to be able to just have some conversation about it as well. They're pulling about 30% of the files from these hospitals and now from doctors' offices for certain payments for just a normal doctor's visit, identifying those, not paying them for any length of time. It becomes a hostile exchange back and forth as 30% of their cash flow gets pulled. It's pulling honest physicians, their files, the same as it is for fraudsters and their files. And it can go back as far as they want it to. As of September of last year, if they want to go back to 10 years ago and pull on a doctor or pull on a hospital and say, we're going to pull this file and we're going to check it as well, they can. Since they're paid a commission, basically somewhere between 9 and 12% per whatever fraud that they find or wrong coding, they have great incentive to go back and search and go as far as they want to go. How do we identify fraud and waste and not create a hostile relationship with good doctors and good physicians in hospitals that are doing the right job? How do you strike a balance on that?
I think anybody who's asked questions about payments is going to have concerns about whether or not they're legitimate and also be concerned about how they're conducting their business. But improper payments, as you know, constitute about $29 billion out of the $108 billion that was mentioned earlier. So it's a large amount, about a third of what is out there now.
A lot of those are paperwork. They miscoded. They would go back and check them. They aren't really fraud. They just in all the checks and everything that's going on. There's a tremendous amount of fraud as well, but just trying to narrow down what was just coded wrong and what's actually fraud, and that's what we want to go after initially.
Well, I think it's different. I think the RAC process is to look more at the waste rather than the fraud. In terms of fraud, you have to have prosecution, and the contractors can't prosecute somebody who's committing fraud. They can report it, of course. But our understanding is that they can only look at about 2% of the billings over a 3-month period. Now, in some cases, that may require some more paperwork, and others it may not. And everything can always be improved, but from what we've seen, and there was a big objection to RAC when it first started, particularly from some of the members of the California delegation. When it spread across the country, clearly as it moves ahead, there are going to be issues that can be addressed. But we think the process works well. They've saved billions of dollars for taxpayers so far, and when that $29 billion goes down further, that frees up more money for Medicare beneficiaries. And I think that's the ultimate goal, is to help the people that truly need help and not keep the money out there that shouldn't be paid.
I completely agree. We've got to be able to make those payments, but we've got to find a way that doesn't trash the relationship. The Federal Government doesn't have a lot greater a relationship with several contractors anyway. Those that are doing a good job, we want to maintain we have a good relationship in the process. This is for any of you as well. Quick story. Last weekend, I get my MasterCard is stopped. I get a phone call immediately and saying I no longer can use it until I call in. I do a quick call in and automation. Within 10 minutes, it's back active again as they've identified something. Is there anything comparable to that in the Federal program for identifying any of the anomalies that may come up to say we're going to stop this and then can correct it in a 10-minute turnaround?
Not that I know of. That would be nice to have. But that also is a function of incompatible accounting systems, financial systems that have been abysmal for years. One of the original Grace Commission findings, and I think it's still true, there are hundreds of incompatible systems across government. That makes it difficult to find out how the money is being spent.
Do we have any agency that's trying to implement something within payments that gets close to that we can raise up as an example and be able to encourage other agencies to look at? Yes, sir.
There is a database that has been created by the administration called the Do Not Pay List, and it is an integration of 7 or 8 different databases from different agencies to ensure that somebody that has been disbarred by one agency for improper dealings won't be given a contract in another agency.
Right, just the suspension and debarment list. Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia, I think, is next. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. Let me ask Mr. Blair first. When we look at something like improper payments, one of the subcommittees formally of this full committee looked at improper payments, and the estimate was something like $125 billion a year. Maybe 50 of it is fraud, in Medicare fraud particularly. But a lot of it is, as Mr. Langford was saying, just bad coding, getting it wrong in terms of who's eligible and not eligible and the like. If we're going to get our arms around $125 billion a year, that's not raising anyone's taxes. It's not cutting any strategic investment. It's just managing more efficiently. What would we have to do?
I think you need to better engage stakeholders into what exactly the improper payment is. And also keep in mind that improper payments are not just overpayments or underpayments as well. So you need to keep in mind that that as government goes about doing its business and putting out money, it needs to keep an accurate check as to what it's expending and what it's authorized to pay for. I think one of the ways that you can look at this is to look at what's going on in the states and localities as well. And one of the things that we've been involved with at the National Academy is what's called a collaborative forum, in which we brought in stakeholders from state, local, nonprofits, the cities, in order to identify best practices and also lessons learned in trying to identify how to stop these kinds of improper payments and what more can be done to improve the administration of these programs.
Mr. Kamensky, I was kind of hoping Mr. Blair would include, however, in his answer, the better deployment of technology. Maybe you could address that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. There are
By the way, has anyone ever told you, if we close our eyes, you sound exactly like Harry Reid? And that's a compliment on this side of the aisle.
Thank you, sir. There are concrete examples of this happening. For example, IBM has worked with the New York Department of Taxation and Finance and developed analytic applications which has saved over $2 billion. Its optimizer software uses a combination of data analytics and models that increase the efficiency of field agents so that they know which audits to go follow. In 2010, there was an overall increase in collections by 12% as a result of better targeting which returns to go check out. The average age of a case decreased by about 10%, so they were able to get quicker turnaround. So the use of analytics in figuring out where the risks are and where the potential returns are help place the agents where they need to be. The U.S. IRS recently created an Office of Compliance Analytics, and they were able to identify last year during the tax season where tax preparers were making consistent mistakes. They were able to send out notices to those people saying, here's what you need to do to change it. And they managed to prevent over $100 million of money going out improperly during the course of the year, so they wouldn't have to go back and recover.
Right. I just point out, the Chairman rightfully pointed out sequestration. Sequestration we're all worried about is $1.2 trillion over 10 years. Improper payments are $1.25 trillion over 10 years. Getting our arms around that would be a really good down payment in terms of the problem. One more question. GAO found that the Department of Defense relies heavily on contractors and then concluded, however, that the lack of an adequate number of trained acquisition and contract oversight personnel contribute to unmet expectations and place the Department at risk of potentially paying more than necessary, an understatement if there ever was one. I'd like your feedback in terms of how much does the lack of adequate training, adequate skilled procurement and contract personnel perhaps contribute to the problem of government waste?
I think the backbone of attacking this problem is making sure you have the right people with the right skills and the right jobs to get this done. And if you don't have the proper training or the proper skill sets, you're not going to be, it's just pouring good money after bad. One of the things that sequestration and also across-the-board cuts do is puts in jeopardy and effectively negates any further efforts at training, because that's among the first monies that goes when you have these kind of cuts. And so I think that Congress is going to have to be mindful that in the future, especially with the reduction, our Federal workforce is at a crossroads, and it has been over the last decade in terms of the changeover from people retiring, bringing in new people, recruitment and retention. And training is an integral part of that, and you need to make sure that that money doesn't go when the budgets are cuts for the departments and agencies, especially across the board.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you highlight a good starting point, but I also think that we have to start with a culture of accountability. And that starts with secretary heads, that starts with agency heads, and you have a whole mantra. I'm from the private sector, so I mean, you're constantly reviewing your workforce. You hold people accountable for that process. And I think there's also, you can actually label this in, we tend to be politically correct. A lot of this is theft, point-blank theft. When we had a hearing here, we actually had a large state in regards to Medicaid fraud, in which was perpetrated within the state bureaucracy. I don't care how you slice it and dice it, it's theft. And we need to hold people accountable for it. Private sector is held to a different standard than public service. I mean, here you just get rotating chairs. And I think there's where we also have to have that accountability process. You have to be able to fire people. You have to have them, when they do intentional wrong, be held accountable for those services and restitution, as well as losing benefits. I think then you'll have many eyes on the prize. I've got a couple questions. As a practicing dentist, we've seen some of the problems within the Medicaid programs and Medicare programs. For Mr. Blair, in your testimony you mentioned that the OMB's collaborative forum has improved HHS grants, Medicare and Medicaid. What were those improvements?
Those improvements were due to the fact that you could bring in state and local health care officials and the types of people who actually are the beneficiary of these programs to look at better ways of accounting for the money and for better ways of obtaining those results that they're trying to do. The forum brings together, what the beauty of the forum does is that it brings together multiple parties from federal, state, and local sectors, the nonprofit sector, to talk about these types of things in an environment which encourages collaboration, best practices sharing, and also looking at problems and the common solutions. It's an ongoing process, but to date we've brought in more than 750 local people. And I think it's also 750 participants, which include local as well as state officials. And the beauty of this is that it recognizes that not all wisdom resides here in Washington, whether it's going back to the state and the locals in order to look at these problems and look at it from not from a top-down solution, but from a bottom-up.
Interesting. And so you would do that on like micro-targeting, or would you have a bigger forum? How would you put those pieces together?
Well, what we've done so far is we've targeted a few pilot projects. One was with the Earned Income Tax Credit, which was done through the Department of the Treasury. And the second one is looking at health care through the Washington State model, which uses analytics at looking at what programs are actually working and what will continue to be funded. One of the other promising areas to look at in terms of this is what's called pay for success, in which a government grant is administered through a third party, and that grant is not given to that third party until certain results are achieved by way of the program. For instance, if you were doing health care and you were looking at or justice programs and you're looking at recidivism, you could say that the third party could agree with the state or local that it's going to receive this money that you're going to reduce recidivism by X%. And if it's not achieved, then that third party doesn't get paid and the government's not at risk. It shifts the risk to these third party payers. And so what you're doing with this is you are giving up a little bit of control, but in fact you're actually enhancing accountability and responsibility by saying that the government's not at risk in these types of grant programs.
But I think in some of those that are patient-specific, you're also dependent upon the patient base to be compliant as well. So you're going to have to be very careful with your metrics in how you measure that, because you could also skew it in an inappropriate way.
The beauty of this, though, is that it's done through a third party such as a philanthropic organization, a nonprofit, a local investor, and that way you don't have the federal government at risk. Most of these grants that the federal government does now, the state and local governments, is that they just pass the check through, and you hope for results. This way, money is not paid by the federal government until results are achieved.
But wouldn't you also want to have some risk to the federal government because they have skin in the game? You don't want to advocate that.
You want skin in the game on all parties.
Absolutely.
In order for something like this to be successful.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for you, Mr. Kamensky. I thank you for coming here today, sir. And what I'm going to ask you to do is elaborate on your testimony a little bit regarding the efforts of the federal government to reduce its energy use. And in your comments, I hope you'll include the Department of Defense. We freshmen in Congress were treated to a CRS seminar some weeks ago where they informed us, some panel members there, that as much as 1/3 of the DOD budget goes to energy consumption. And in fact, you heard here today Ranking Member Cummings quoting CRS and its evaluation of DOD's overall efficiency as being poor performance. As you note in your testimony, the Federal Government is the country's largest consumer of both energy and water. The Federal Government can lead by example in increasing energy efficiency, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, conserving water, and preventing pollution. And your organization has written about the ambitious efforts that the administration has undertaken to make this a reality. Mr. Kamensky, can you tell us a little bit more about the executive order President Obama issued that was aimed at making government operations more sustainable? What do you believe will be the short and long-term impacts of that executive order?
Mr. Cartwright, the executive order draws upon a number of other executive orders and statutes, and it sets a target of reducing greenhouse gas and increasing the reliance on alternative energy sources other than coal-based. One of the things that we had a report that was done on the implementation of this executive order by Dr. Fiorino, who used to be actually at the Environmental Protection Agency and is now at American University. And he had a number of findings. He says there's a mismatch between the expectations in the executive order versus what can actually be done in terms of action by the agencies, in part because there's not an investment or a set of incentives. And one of the things that he was suggesting is, much like in the private sector, is to allow sort of trading of energy costs between agencies. And the other is allow an investment fund so that agencies can borrow money but have to then pay it back once there is energy savings that have been incurred. And so this becomes something that takes place over a period of years. The Department of Defense has something similar to that, where private industry will come in, they will put something in place, and then they will get paid back out of the energy savings that come out of that program. And that has been used in a number of military bases. I don't believe it's a widespread initiative across the department, but it does show that there is the return on investment that comes from energy savings.
Okay. And I know it's only been 2 years since that executive order was issued, but how do you think the administration has done so far in terms of implementing it?
The administration set energy savings as a cross-agency priority goal. There are 14 in the Government Performance Results Act modernization law. Earlier this year, or earlier last year, one of the 14 cross-cutting goals was around energy savings, and it said that it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 28% by 2020, and indirect greenhouse gases by 13% from a 2008 baseline. So they have real measures, and they are reporting every quarter on the progress against their goals in a report that's posted on the web. They're looking at the impact on 500,000 buildings that the Federal Government manages. And in 2011, they reduced emissions by 8.3% from the 2008 fiscal year baseline. So there is progress being made against the targets that were set, in part because the executive order helped put these things into motion.
Thank you. And finally, where do you see a need for improvement in the administration's implementation efforts?
Well, one of the things, as Dr. Fiorino mentioned, is this ability to create incentives, much like in the private sector, of allowing trade-offs between agencies, and the other is to creating an investment fund so that agencies can go in with an ROI where they're going to recover the costs and therefore make longer-term investments.
Thank you very much.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Yield.
Mr. Cartwright, I enjoyed this exchange. I think it was very good for us to hear it. But at the beginning, when you mentioned that as much as a third of DOD's budget went for energy, is it a little bit more minute than that? No one on our side seems to be able to find a third. In other words, when you get past labor, which is so much, there isn't a third left that we could find after labor and outsourced contracting. Could you elaborate on what the nuance of that one-third is?
That's why I raised it, Mr. Chairman. I was shocked when I heard that number. It was from one of the panelists presented by the CRS. I think that merits further investigation.
Excellent. I would ask that you try to get the details of that. We'll include it in the record because I think that's an extremely important point, and I was glad you made it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for a round of questions. Ms. Alexander, you know, you have the best title in Washington, Taxpayers for Common Sense. Now, next week, we're going to have our annual high-risk list coming out, the 2013 list. And it's no surprise to you or Mr. Schatz or any of you that that list will include DOD, Medicare, Medicaid. The Post Office has managed to get on that. For the most part, the people that are on it are always on it, and they never get off it. Isn't that basically the truism?
Absolutely. I mean, they narrow or broaden or alter, but it seems like it's much more static of a list than we'd like to see.
Well, let me ask you it's a detailed question, but I'll make it a little bit long. There's that expression about Albert Einstein saying if you keep doing the same thing over and over again expecting a different result, that's the definition of insanity. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. Is it time, and I think it is, but is it time that we seriously look at our inspectors general, at the act and the power to not just make suggestions, not just tell people that there's huge waste, but in fact take a more active role, an enforcement role in insisting those changes occur? Isn't it essentially at the GAO and the IG that we've recognized repeatedly these hundreds of billions, and through both Republican and Democratic administrations, we've seen them come back saying they're going to do it, and then we see the exact same things or more on the list the next year? Either of you?
I absolutely think that there needs to be increased powers for GAO and the IGs in terms of enforcement. I know this committee has been looking at legislation to make that possible, and that's something we support. I think there are some agencies where we'd be particularly happy to see that happen. Of course, DOD because of the scale. You know, Taxpayers for Common Sense has talked at length about the concerns about the Army Corps of Engineers. I think that's their Department of Interior, just again because of the sheer scale of what they manage in both revenue and programs. So we definitely would support efforts to give the IGs and GAO more authority and power to get information and enforce issues.
Well, I agree generally with that point, but if there are no consequences for wasting money, money will continue to be wasted, and those consequences either come in the form of changing a program, eliminating a program, or sending someone to jail, although the last time I remember that probably was the Boeing tanker lease, the original tanker lease debacle, where people
the so-called lease.
The lease, yes, the so-called lease, yes. And so I'm not suggesting that there are people out there that should be incarcerated, but either there should be an incentive for performing your job at a certain level. There have been suggestions that agencies retain some of the money they get back if they recover it, and there should also be a disincentive for performing your job incorrectly, and that really rarely happens. And Congress doesn't have the power to hire and fire people, neither does the President. You know, you can do it by reducing budgets or cutting, staff in an appropriations bill, but that's pretty rare.
Well, let me ask a question, a very tight question here. Currently, if you're an IG, you can talk about debarment, but you're not able to do it. Is that an example of something where actually bringing a debarment action by the IGs as a regular part of enforcing against contractors, and then perhaps other motions that could be brought where the IG would have direct standing even when it was not criminal? But for example, the GSA scandal, all of you got to see them sitting here. You got to see the former administrator telling all of us, to our amazement, that the reason that the individual in the bathtub got his bonus was because he was entitled to it. That's an example that the question is, should we change the dynamic so that somebody other than the next person up the chain has input into whether you either deny somebody's ability to continue doing business with the government, or at least, in the case if they're employees of the government, deny some of their ups and adds, affect their promotion, affect their pay grade increases, and certainly affect their bonuses?
Well, you'd probably have to change the Civil Service Act to address misconduct. for one, because I'm sure there are rules that prevent that from happening.
Well, bonuses are currently by law discretionary.
Yeah. Well, but
it doesn't appear that way when you look at the performance versus the bonuses. And I will say that in a report that I recently reviewed of ours, what I noticed was that there are agencies that have very small bonuses, and there are agencies that have huge percentage of bonuses. And I can't say that as the bonus goes up as a percentage that those agencies are the ones that you would be pleased with.
I mean, I certainly think that increasing the ability of IGs and kind of independent actors to do something would be positive. And I also think it may also have an effect on Congress's ability to respond to some of the ways they see. Because, you know, we all the time criticize things that happen, but we know that it is difficult to find real agreement across party lines and across committee lines when you're trying to make a change. So I think if there's more action within the agency, and I think the question on bonuses, I mean, for debarment, for bonus payments on contracts, I mean, those legal issues are different than they are for government employees, but they're probably solvable without a statutory change, I would think. But
okay. Any other comments, Mr. Blair, Mr. Kamensky?
I found really curious that statement about the bonuses being entitled to, because as you pointed out, they are not. And bonuses are supposed to be awarded for exceptional achievement, and it seems to be an abuse of that system when it's viewed as an entitlement rather than as part of your everyday salary. One of the questions that I would have about debarment and giving more authority to the IGs is there a way that we can use this not after the fact, but before the fact? Because we see a lot of these scandals occur, and we're always looking at them after the money has already gone out the door, after the bad acting has occurred, and oftentimes after the bad actors may be out of government.
And that is a great question for another hearing, and we will be picking up where you left off. And with that, I'm going to announce that we're going to go to the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes, but we will then recess until immediately following the second vote. The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panel. I had a chance to read your reports last night, and they were very comprehensive and very thoughtful, and some might even say fearless in some of the areas that you decided to point out to us. And as a local government official, when I was on a county board, I used to co-chair a Reinventing Government committee where we looked at efficiencies and savings. And as a state legislator, I served on Governor Scott Walker's Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Commission, where we did, again, the same thing at the state level. So I really appreciate this conversation, especially when we look at the thoughtful ways to do it. I guess one of the concerns I have, when Mr. Mica was chairing, he brought up sequestration. I have to admit, being one of the freshmen and being new, there seems to be a Washington way of doing things and then a way the rest of the country operates, especially those of us in the Midwest. I think we like to think we're a little more common sense. If the car is about to run out of oil, we put oil in the tank rather than let it completely grind to a grinding halt and then try to fix it later. And sequestration is one of those issues that's coming up, and that's what was talked about. It's in a few weeks. We can always come back and try to fix something later, but it just doesn't necessarily make sense. And I know, Ms. Alexander, I appreciated reading your report sliding past sequestration, and I noticed you have a little bit of that Midwestern common sense. You went to school in Wisconsin. Congratulations. And you have a line in here that says specifically, sequestration is bad. It would cut the good along with the bad, the effective, and the wasteful. It is irresponsible. And, again, coming in new, not from being from Washington around when this happened, I would kind of concur with your thoughts on that. But I also have fears as I talk to a lot of constituents about what's going to happen in the next few weeks rather than trying to fix it after the fact. I was just wondering if you could maybe address, just for some of us who are new, although everyone's kind of running off to a vote right now, but some of the areas that if we do the sequestration, you've done a great job and I think very fearless of covering a lot of different areas of cuts. What are some of the areas that, if sequestration happens, are some of those effective and some of those good, they're going to potentially be hurt?
Well, I am Midwestern, so I appreciate the Midwestern kind of practicalness, and I think that's part of the reason why I do what I do, is coming from Wisconsin and Illinois, I've always looked for the solutions. I think that if you look across the board, I mean, everybody agrees that we have a need for a strong national defense. Everybody agrees we need the Pentagon to operate at a very high level of efficiency, and there are good programs within the Pentagon. But that kind of conviction and consensus that we need a strong national defense has been exactly what has allowed the waste that exists at the Pentagon to thrive and grow. So I think there's kind of no way other than doing the very hard work of looking at things program by program, dollar by dollar, to say, actually, you know what, our return on investment for this is really good. We are reducing risk, or we are getting something for it. There are, I'm trying to think of kind of within the context of the Pentagon, we're in the business of, we're kind of naysayers a lot of the time. So I'm much quicker with what not to do than with what to do. But I think that, again, I was thinking about kind of what's our approach to reducing waste. Our approach to reducing waste is just to do it. So you really just have to look program by program, because every program started for a reason, because somebody thought it was a good idea. There's going to be somebody to defend it. So you just got to make sure you're looking through and saying, this has delivered on the promise that we said would be there. So, okay, let's give it a little more money, or tweak it this way, and look at other things and say, Mr. Schatz and I have both worked on kind of the Joint Strike Fighter, other programs where it's just like, the alternate entry program, we're just throwing good money after bad. We just got to stop.
If I could throw in one thing quickly. We did talk about these GAO reports a few times. Senators Coburn and Sessions estimate that the information there shows about $400 billion in annual waste, duplication. Let's call it duplication and overlap. It may not all be waste. But you have 209 of these STEM programs. No one knows which one works. The GAO says the duplication is causing ineffectiveness. So if we're trying to improve something and get higher science and math achievement, get rid of the programs that don't work. And that's where really all of this should start.
Sure. Well, and Mr. Chair, I just want to, again, I want to thank the panel. I really thought you went into a lot of areas of sacred cows, like we talked about, that are a little difficult sometimes for people to talk about. I really appreciated the suggestions. And with that, I'd yield back time for the vote.
I thank the gentleman, and as promised, we will stand in recess until immediately following the second vote.